Are you saying that in a culturally pluralistic society such as America, are you saying that the variable in success or lack of success is the culture of the particular group?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. The kind of crime that we see in many black neighborhoods is entirely new. I grew up in the Richtown housing project in North Philadelphia, and we didn't go to bed to the sounds of gunshots. And many people, they did not lock their door until 11 o'clock or 10 o'clock at night when everybody was home.
When I grew up in Harlem in the 40s and 50s, I never heard a gunshot. There were old men who you could see sit on a hot summer night, sitting outdoors into the wee hours playing cards or checkers or whatever. It was a different world. Most black kids, even under slavery, had lived with two parents. And that was true all the way up until the 1960s.
In 1880s, the 75% of black kids lived in two-parent families.
After the civil rights victories in the sort of late 60s, where black people began to create this identity that we called blackness, it was angry, and it was resentful, and it was separatist. There was the illusion in it somehow that we would get farther as a separate, unified people than we would by joining America and becoming regular citizens.
There was a period, I'm trying to remember now, I believe it was in the mid-70s, when substandard English began to become viewed as a discipline of its own within linguistic studies and so forth. And for all I know, it was all perfectly legitimate that certain speech patterns would be traced back to various regions in Africa and so forth. And this is a language of its own. It has its own validity.
None of these things went back to Africa. For example, using the word axe for ask and stuff like that. All of that goes back to the South. And it goes back to the parts of Britain from which white Southerners came. So if you trace calling hog entrails chitlins, that was in a certain section of Britain, the section from which whites moved into the South, and they were known as rednecks and crackers in Britain in centuries past before they ever set foot in the South. That very same subculture held whites in the South back as well. That in the time this mental testing in the First World War turned up, among other things, the fact that whites from various 4 or 5 southern states scored lower on the mental test than blacks from 4 or 5 northern states. And so it really was a question of the subculture that was there, which was a handicap to both. If you look at what actually happens in the wake of these wonderful sounding policies, you see disaster after disaster.
Often out of humanitarian concern, fathers have left home in order for their children to get meat and bread.
Children raised without 2 parents present. That was about 22% in 1960. One generation later, it was 67%. And it's gone up a little since then as well.
No, so the last time I went to the welfare, the lady told me, said if you have a living husband, that they couldn't give you no help.
Why did black Americans prove susceptible to that change first?
Because they were poor. I don't think that many Asian American girls who are preparing to go off to Stanford or Harvard are going to say, hey, I can live on welfare, why should I abstain?
Now, I'm not into a sexual bag when you're supposed to start having sex, but I know that if you are born and you find out that your mother is 14 and your grandmother is 30 and you don't know who or where your father is, that is a hell of a start on life. You know, you're doomed to repeat that cycle. Now, if you say that racism is the cause of that, well, then you'd have to explain why was black illegitimacy 12% in 1940, or why was black teenage pregnancy in 1918 less than white teenage pregnancy in 1918. And surely it was much more racial discrimination back then than there is now.
Ways of holding blacks in slavery at low cost was to keep the people dependent as much as possible. It's ironic that that same principle comes up in the welfare state 100 years later.
If you have been an oppressed people, and we were obviously truly oppressed for centuries, we learned all sorts of things in order to survive that. I won't go into a long list, but we learned how to reinvent ourselves. We learned how to live with this oppression, with this sort of negative force in your life. We created a great music out of this. We did other things that had a worldwide impact. We expanded the idea of democracy and made freedom an absolute. We did all those things. The one thing we never had a chance to do, was to live in freedom.
Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside.
Historically, it scared the hell out of us. We would be fantasizing if we denied that. Who wouldn't be? Freedom is a frightening thing. It places such a burden of responsibility on you, on the person who has it. You're now responsible. Your reputation is based now on what you do.
You cite 6 groups in 2 categories. You cite Jews, Chinese, and Japanese as overachieving groups. You cite blacks, Puerto Ricans, and Mexicans as underachieving groups. Now, what are you describing there? What have you identified there as a variable?
Oh, income, well, the achievement is measured in terms of income and occupation. That is economic achievement. Obviously, there are other kinds of things that make up life. But, and I wouldn't want to stigmatize groups as permanently underachievers. If you look at generation by generation, you find incredible changes. The black population especially. The change in occupations of blacks between the 1920s and the 1950s is just phenomenal. So that what we're watching are people who, for cultural reasons and historical reasons, begin behind a certain level and have not closed the gap. It's like a relay race. You don't say that the runner is a bad runner because he hasn't closed the gap when he started 50 yards behind. If he's 40 yards behind now, we don't call him a failure. We say he's made up 10 yards. Blacks started much further behind. I don't think people realize how much further behind blacks started and how much progress has been made. There's a distinguished economic historian, Robert Higgs, who has said that for blacks to go from being completely illiterate in the middle of the 19th century to being 1/2 literate, and by 1900 is just an amazing achievement in the history of the world, that you very seldom find that kind of change that quickly. So it depends on what you're holding as your standard.
The standard is that blacks haven't caught up with whites.
But whites haven't stood still.
You quote in Intellectuals and Race the famous black writer James Baldwin. He's writing in 1960, quote, "People in Harlem know they are living there because white people do not think they are good enough to live anywhere else. In a new housing project in Harlem, they naturally began smashing windows, defacing walls, and, you'll forgive me, but this is his language, urinating in the elevators," close quote. What's wrong with his thinking?
Oh my gosh, you'd need a couple of hours. But it so happens I grew up in Harlem in the 1940s, 1950s, and you didn't expect to find people urinating in places where black people lived. In fact, there's very little attention given to the fact that the public housing of that era was radically different from the public housing of today. I remember we had a relative of ours got into some public housing. We were so proud because you had to have a certain character, a record, and so forth to get in. These were not places where you had dumping grounds for people who were at the bottom of the pile.
In Intellectuals and Race, you cite an observation by the intelligence expert, IQ scientist James Flynn, that just stopped me cold. After the Second World War, you've got large numbers of American troops remaining in Germany. For that matter, there's still several tens of thousands there today. And both black and white American soldiers had children with German women. And Flynn discovered that those children growing up in Germany showed no IQ differences at all. The black kids and the white kids, the same. Quote, quoting Intellectuals and Race, Professor Flynn concluded that the reason was that the offspring of black soldiers in Germany, and now you're quoting Professor Flynn, grew up in a nation with no black subculture, close quote. Which means what? Which means they experienced exactly the same expectations. Is this the...
No, the expectations are external. The culture in which they grew up was not the culture in which black kids grew up in America today.
So they had...
There's no gangster rap.
You say the Chinese succeed because they outwork everyone else.
Oh, yes.
Is it that simple?
In a sense, yes. That if you put in enormous amounts of work, you're going to have a tremendous advantage over people who don't. A study was done in San Francisco schools to show Asians, blacks, whites, Hispanics, and how they score in various fields, and mathematics in particular. And there were vast differences, for example, between the Asians and blacks in terms of how many got high math grades. What struck me was that for both the Asians and the Africans, the number of hours that you spent working or doing homework in math was almost identical with the same percentage who got high grades in math. So that whether you're black or Chinese, if you spend an awful lot of time on the math, you're going to be doing better than the person who's not. And although there were great disparities, the disparities were differences in how much time you spent on math homework.
There are basically two narratives that people concerned about persisting racial inequality can adopt. The first is white America must reform itself. We need more of this or that, whatever the this or that is of the latter-day agenda of the race reformers. We need more of this or we need more of that. White America must reform itself. Racism must end. You see it in the New York Times every day. But the other narrative, which I take very seriously and for which I think there's a ton of evidence, I'm calling the development narrative. I'm saying that you have to look at the processes by which people come to acquire skills, traits, habits, and orientations that lend themselves to successful participation in American society. The development narrative puts more onus on the responsibilities of African Americans to be engaged in the processes that lead to the development of full human potential, and points towards solving the actual problems rather than this kind of wishful argument. If we could double the budget for this program, then the homicide rate amongst young African American males would go down.
What do people do with freedom when they don't know how to handle it? They reinvent their oppression, even as it has faded away. They make it up in their mind all over again. Racism is around every corner. There is systemic racism. There's structural racism. There are microaggressions, and there's white privilege. Rather than say, oh my goodness, we in fact, it is over. Our oppression is over with. We really are free people. We scream to high heavens that Steele is crazy, that it's laughable. Can't you see racism everywhere? White supremacy is just infused into literally the air of America, so that black people are, well, what is this longing for an identity, a black identity grounded in victimization, is a longing for an excuse to not accept the challenge of freedom. It is a way to escape that challenge.
When I look at the success of groups like Black Lives Matter and gaining the public's imagination, capturing the public's imagination, I'm very pessimistic about this. I believe that groups like that or that type of thinking is ascendant in the country right now. The whole social justice movement makes me very pessimistic.
Freedom it comes with a judgmentalism. It judges you. If you don't know how to thrive in freedom, it means that you are at fault. You are, in the worst word you can use regarding blacks, you are inferior. It's a chilling idea, but it's at the heart. It is the heart of the shock of freedom. Because freedom now is saying you can't use oppression as an excuse anymore. If you're not doing well, It's not because of oppression. For goodness sakes, we've got affirmative action. We've got everything to help you. If you're not doing well now, it's on you.
Whose job is it to say, wrong subculture, folks, you're harming yourselves?
Well, I would think in an ideal world that intellectuals might take on that task, but the world that we live in, I've noticed, is not ideal.